My name is Stuart Rockoff. I'm the Executive Director of the Mississippi Humanities Council, and we are very excited to have you join us for the 5th episode or installment of our MS+ virtual program series. We've been doing this since December, and we've had a great time working with our colleagues from Mass Humanities. And for me in particular, it's been great working with Catherine Stevens. So I'd love to turn it over to Catherine to kind of walk us through some of the basics here.
Sure. Thanks, Stuart. And hi, everyone. It's really good to see everybody coming in here tonight. So as Stuart said, I am with Mass Humanities. And first, I just want to say also thank you to Stuart and to everyone, our staffs at both of our councils, for doing all of the work and the behind the scenes work to make this program possible. So I'm just going to go over a couple of housekeeping things. So if you haven't already, you can update your name by adding your state's initials to the front of your name. So this helps us when we move to the discussion portion of the program. We make breakout rooms, and we put you in breakout rooms with a good mix of people, not everyone from your own state, but we mix Massachusetts and Mississippi and anyone else who's come to join us tonight. So you'll see instructions for doing that in the chat, and I'm also going to read those instructions to you if you don't know how to open the chat. So to change your name, you're going to want to, if you're on a laptop or a computer, hover over the sort of the bottom of this Zoom screen, and you're going to look for a little icon that says participants. If you click that, then that should open up a window with a list of everyone who's in our event today, and your name should be at the top. So if you find your name and you select a button next to your name, it should say more, or it should say rename. You can select that. Look for rename, and you click that. That'll open up a little window where you'll see your name, and you can put MA, MS, DC, PA, wherever you're from, at the top. If you're on a phone or a tablet, usually you need to tap the screen in order to bring up that participants icon. So if you do that, if you tap the screen, that should bring up the participants icon, and you can follow the steps from there. If those instructions aren't working for you, don't worry. We will also, behind the scenes, be able to work on helping you change your name based on the registration information that we have for you. I think everyone is doing this, but if you're not already muted, please do take a moment to mute yourself. So that's usually in the bottom left-hand portion of your screen, a little microphone button that you will make sure is turned off. You'll have moments in this event to be able to talk with each other and unmute yourself, but for the first portion, we're going to ask you to try to stay on mute so we can focus on our panelists. So finally, I think you should be seeing me and Stuart. If you're seeing dozens of faces, that means you're in gallery view. If you want to be in speaker view, that gives you, the view of the people who are speaking, at the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you should see a speaker button square that you can select, and that will give you the image of people who are speaking. So if you have any other trouble, you can put a question in the chat, and our staff behind the scenes will help you out. So now I'm happy to get to the really exciting part of the program, getting to introduce the topic and our speakers, and I will turn it back over to Stuart for that.
Thanks a lot, Catherine. When we got together as staffs to think about what types of topics we would be addressing during this series, we thought a lot about what themes connect our states. And pretty early on, we talked about the struggle over school integration. And so we are very excited about tonight's extremely kind of illustrious panel. And I could give long introductions for each of our panelists, but because our time is tight, we've got a lot to cover. I'm going to give sort of abbreviated ones. So please bear with me. Douglas Blackman is a journalist, writer, documentary filmmaker, and a professor of media at Georgia State University. Doug is the author of Slavery by Another Name, The Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II, which won the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction and was the basis for an acclaimed documentary. For the past few years, Doug has been working on a new documentary called The Harvest about school integration in his hometown of Leland, Mississippi. We also have Donna Bivens, who is an anti-racism consultant, trainer, and coach who directed the Union of Minority Neighborhoods Boston Busing Desegregation Project, which documents the school integration crisis and, importantly, connects this history to our continuing issues with equity today. Dr. Jean Middleton Hairston is an educator, activist, and public servant. As a college student, she was a co-author of the groundbreaking history textbook, Mississippi Conflict and Change, which is an amazing story for another program, unfortunately, but look it up. Jean was a professor of education at Millsaps College, her alma mater, for many years, and later served as the national director of the Freedom Schools program for the Children's Defense Fund. She currently serves as a member of the Jackson Public School Board. And finally, we are honored to have Byron Rushing, who served in the Massachusetts House of Representatives from 1983 to 2018. That's 35 years, if my math is correct. Earlier, from 1972 to 1985, he led the Museum of Afro-American History in Boston. Among many other things, back in the 1960s, he was active in the civil rights movement, working for the Congress of Racial Equality, as well as the Northern Student Movement. We want to begin in the first part of our program by talking with Donna and Doug. And I want to begin with Doug, and hopefully Doug had some technical problems, but he's back. Thanks so much for joining us, Doug. I want you to talk a little bit about how the story of school integration played out in your hometown of the Mississippi Delta and in Leland, Mississippi. What was that story?
Well, I think you can summarize it up in a lot of ways as that it was a story that played out sort of two different ways in the Delta towns. And I was in the class that started the first grade in 1970. And so that was in the fall of 1970. So that class that graduated in 1982, as many of you know, I'm sure, that was the first group because of the Holmes decision by the U.S. Supreme Court in October of 1969. That was the decision that finally broke the back of formal legalized school segregation. When the court ordered that all the schools in Mississippi, the separate systems operating under freedom of choice, be combined at the beginning of 1970 in most places over a 2-week period of time. And the black and white schools were pushed together for the rest of that year, and then in the fall of 1970 reopened as fully integrated schools for the full year for the first time. And so I started the first grade coincidentally then. Always striking to me though, I didn't know that. I didn't know I was part of that group until I was in college. So it was like 20 years went by before I knew that. But I certainly knew something was going on. Or at an early point, was aware, number one, that it was unusual among the white families that I knew and the white kids that I knew, folks who I went to church with, Boy Scouts, all those kinds of things, that it was very unusual as a white kid that I was in the public schools. That obviously was the thing that I was aware of right away. And I think that the way things played out, there were two scenarios in the Delta and most other places. You either had places like Leland, where a relatively small but meaningful group of white families, for various reasons, decided to stick with the public schools. It never was very many, really, but any number was significant in those circumstances. Or it was that all the white folks took off completely. There really wasn't any other scenario. There was no scenario of a genuinely significant number of white families remaining, at least not that I'm aware of. And if they did, it was only very briefly. And then the way it played out was that at first there was what felt like a kind of successful thing of that the public schools did retain some white families and that there was some integration. And it certainly was successful for kids like me. I benefited tremendously from going to the public schools and interacting with a much more real version of the world than if I had gone to Leland Academy or Washington School in Greenville or some of the other SAG Academy options and private school options that popped up. I benefited tremendously from what happened. But it also, everything was still done in a way that not necessarily out of any sort of malice exactly. I mean, there was malice among some of the people who fled, but even among the people who stayed, white and black, there were both heroic things done, good things done. There were also a lot of mistakes made. The biggest mistakes, in my estimation, was that most decisions were still being made based on how do we help reduce anxiety among white people. That was still the primary concern was, and so even though the reason all this was happening was to end these decades and decades and centuries really of injury to African Americans, the remedy was finally, in the end, was still totally oriented to white people. And how do we keep them satisfied? And so white folks' mascots were what were preserved. You know, the white high schools' colors and mascots became the integrated schools' colors and mascot. For the most part, it was the white coaches stayed the head coaches, the white principals stayed the principals. You know, all of those kinds of things that were intended to stabilize and reassure white people still were seen as paramount. And so there was a failure in all of that to create, from the very beginning, a genuinely unified community, a genuinely unified place. And in the end, that bred its own kinds of animosities and difficulties. And so to sum it up quickly, the way that things played out was that I had a very integrated school experience in many ways, benefited much from it. I think all the white kids who went through that process did. I think most of the high achieving African-American kids did too. I'm not certain that it was the best thing for everybody. I think, and today I'm much more aware of the tremendous loss that there was the African-American community in the ending of the institutions of the formerly segregated schools, and just how important they had been, even though history demanded that all of that come to an end. But in the end, the way it played out was the way that it played out almost everywhere. That in the end, all the white people left. It just took longer in the places in places like Leland, where some white people had stayed and did stay, you know, for 10 years or 15 years. And there are a handful of white families and white students in the public schools in Leland today, but for the most part, only in the lowest grades, in elementary grades. One of my classmates is now the school superintendent, and two other of my classmates are the president of the school board and on the school board now, all three of them African Americans. Basically, there are no white kids, none of the white kids from my era, or almost none of the white kids from my era are still there at all, or in the town at all. But I have a lot of my African American classmates and friends who are still there and really pretty valiantly doing everything that they can. And
nope, I think we lost Doug for a quick sec. We'll wait and see if we kind of get him back. But certainly one of the things that he referenced that was Segregation Academy. So what happened was a lot of when that court decision was put into place, sort of the white families created, oftentimes overnight, new private schools that became known informally as segregation academies. And so sort of a lot of the private schools in Mississippi, frankly, you know, trace their roots to 1970. So it looks like Doug has been kicked out of the Zoom. Hopefully he will be able to rejoin us. So this is a great time to turn it over to Donna. So Donna, hearing about how the story played out in Mississippi, tell us about, and I'm taking Catherine's role here, but we're sort of scrambling because Doug got kicked out. Yeah.
So I think what we want to know is, you know, what was the story in Massachusetts for folks who don't know that story, particularly in Boston? I think a lot of people think of school integration, desegregation, they think of a place like Mississippi, but they don't think about Boston. Oh, I think you might be on mute, Donna.
That's right. You don't usually think about Boston, but Representative Rushing will flesh out the details. It's hard to understand Boston's mandated school integration crisis without knowing the context. In Boston, Black education activists, most of whom were parents, had led a generations-long struggle for quality education for their children and, with others, for all children. Boston is known historically as a center of abolitionism and often assumed to be very liberal and forward-thinking. In many ways, it is. There was and is much anti-racism and activism here, but issues of systemic racism show up here in a very particular way, as it does in every part of the country. It's there, but it shows up differently. Those Black education activists had tried many things to get quality education and resources for their children and for all children. When the Morgan versus Hennigan lawsuit against the school committee was filed in 1972, it was really a last resort. People had tried so many things to get quality education and to get resources for Black children. What's important here is that the judge who oversaw it, Judge Garrity, made sure that a total analysis of what was holding racism in the schools in place was made. So he looked at everything. He and the people that were trying to really make some change looked at everything and all the things that you couldn't necessarily see on the surface that were holding systemic racism in place and holding inequity in place. And it turned out that Boston was found, unlike a lot of northern cities, to have de jure segregation. That is, that segregation was being legally maintained very intentionally and very consciously. What got focused on and got a lot of attention was the busing crisis between Black neighborhoods and South Boston and some other areas. South Boston was a largely working class white Irish neighborhood. South Boston reacted to Black children being sent there with fury and some blatant racism and violence that grabbed national and international attention. So it was headlined, and Boston's reputation, it confused a lot of people. I have to say that's the year I moved to Boston. It really confused me. What the many who worked on the Boston desegregation project learned was that even then the story was much bigger and much more complex than that conflagration that we always focus on. What's true is that the turmoil it was very traumatic and disruptive for many people for many years, up till now. But what is also true is that the roots of racism at the foundation of this country is what fed that fire. What makes it so that's what makes it so that we're continuing to have the same elusive struggle for quality education for everybody, for a quality education system for Black, Indigenous people, color, and impoverished white people to this day. As Doug was saying, those are the people that it didn't work for, right? Those who keep fighting for equity point out that deep changes were made that really address systemic racism because of the order. And yet it's also true that there's been a lot of resistance to equitable access to education for all, and many question how much things have or haven't improved. And as an example of that, the Boston Public Schools has yet to meet the minimum number of Black and other people of color teachers required by Judge Garrity's order, even though the percentage of students of color has increased. So huge inequities continue to exist, and we're sure COVID will exacerbate that. But at the same time, people are just continuing to do this work with such dedication. I just keep going back to Angela Davis's quote, her book, "Freedom is a constant struggle," and people are still struggling for quality education. And that's not, as someone said in the chat, it wasn't about, integration. It was really about getting a quality education for everyone.
Thank you, Donna. I see that Doug has been able to come back in. And so we initially thought we were going to interview Doug and then Donna, but I think we're just going to mix it up. And so maybe we'll pass it back to Doug now. And then Donna, I'll follow up with some questions for you.
Yeah, so Doug, I would love for you to explain why you chose the name The Harvest for your documentary. So what is that metaphor to you?
Well, obviously, the Delta is a farming place, and so the harvest is the thing that people are very conscious of all the time. There's always a coming harvest, but in this case, what it's really about is that the observation that I make, that what I view as perhaps the central paradox of American society at this stage of its development, and that is that we're this country that was defined in race and in slavery from its beginnings, shaped by race and slavery ever since that time, now shaped by race and an effort to try to move away from the legacy of slavery in halting ways. And here we are at a particular juncture where over the last 50 years, the period of time that we're talking about, that this is a society that has made fantastic progress in terms of racial progress and movement toward equity, that, you know, even with all the problems that remain by any sort of empirical measure, we've had tremendous success. I mean, it's just astounding the difference between the Leland, Mississippi world of 1970 that I was beginning the first grade in, and the world that my children have grown up in Atlanta, or even the kind of racism and discrimination that people may still see in a little town in the Delta today, is still incredibly different from what it was 50 years ago. And so against all of that astonishing progress, yet we're still a society that if the word came right now that a cop had just killed somebody on the streets of Atlanta and that half the city was in flames, none of us would be particularly surprised. We live in anticipation of a catastrophe at all times. And we've seen versions of these catastrophes play out. And so how is that? Why is that? Why is it that we live in a society that is so paradoxically contradictory to itself? And I think that that's the harvest. That the world we live in is the harvest of our failure to have, I won't say a failure to have seriously tried to make things the way they should be, because a lot of people have tried really hard. Obviously, a whole lot of African American people have tried hard, and a reasonable number of white people have tried hard. But in the end, we have been pursuing and we've been trying to find our way to this place on a path that does not lead there, and for the most part, and so that's the harvest. The harvest is that many people have sacrificed. Many people have worked very, very hard. Black people have sacrificed and lost exponentially more than anyone else. And yet we still are not at that place that Dr. King described in I Have a Dream speech, that the sons and daughters of former slaves and slave owners would play together and go to school together, play together on the red clay hills of Georgia. You know, we're the black dirt of the Mississippi Delta. You know, we're not at that place. And the children of Leland, Mississippi, and the children of my Black classmates and grandchildren of my Black classmates now live in a world that is what I call separate but kind of equal. You know, that's really the reality of what has come to pass. But what is also startling over these last few years, as I've spent a lot of time meeting many of them for the first time, since I don't live there, but interviewing young people and middle-aged people and people who taught in the Black schools and then in the white schools, and there's every range of possibility of people in my hometown. I know it's so much better now than I did when I lived there. But one of the most striking things from all that is the degree to which that the children of my hometown, the Black children of my hometown, are more isolated from white people and vice versa than could ever have been the case in the 1960s or the 1970s. The Black kids in my hometown, for the most part, only encounter white people through the occasional Teach for America volunteer who passes through the school system as a teacher. But the depth of separation today is profound. The level of animosity is much less, you know, ironically. But the depth of separation and the injuries that come from that, the deprived opportunities that are the consequence of that, are very serious. And every year probably make the task of creating that place I think all would agree we wish was what our country was. Every year it gets harder to do that. Every year that goes by that has this atrophied, ossified, de facto separation, culturally built-in separation, becomes a harder and harder thing to ever overcome.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah, I mean that sense of the long-term impact, the ongoing story seems so central both to your work, Doug, and Donna, to the project that you led. So I think maybe I'd like to hear about from Donna. You led this project called the Boston Busting Desegregation Project, and like your project, Doug, it was about listening to people and hearing their stories. And so, Donna, I wonder if you could say a little bit about what stories you were looking for when that project got started. What did you think was overlooked, and what inspired that project?
Well, I love that question, because when Union Minority Neighborhood started the project, it was because they were doing work on mass incarceration. They were doing work on criminal records reform, and what happened was they kept hearing a lot of stories about desegregation, and so what they did then was to follow that thread to see why were people working on quarry reform, and I should say Black, white, and other working on quarry reform, talking so much about desegregation. So we started the project to answer that question, to find out why this kept coming up. And, to be quite honest, we got a lot of criticism about not starting with, in quotes, a broader audience. And at that time, I wasn't sure, but now I think that was exactly the audience to start with. The audience for whom things weren't working and for whom they hadn't recovered and who had been highly traumatized by that era. And to move from there to everybody else. And we really tried to move as broadly as we could. So we didn't just talk to Bostonians. We talked to people who'd been from other cities who were in school in Boston. We talked to the suburbs. We talked to churches. So we got a larger understanding, but it was really important to hear those stories in relationship to each other, that you can't just hear, it's sort of like a myth of objectivity. There's no objectivity. You have to start someplace. And so for us, it's really important to start with the people who see what's not working.
Maybe this is a question for both panelists, since we have about 5 more minutes in this portion of our program. Is there a particular story from either of your projects that sort of has stuck in your memory?
Well, I'll jump in, I guess. One thing and this relates a little bit back to something that Donna was just saying too, I think. For me, I've been working on this film in a way for more than 40 years. This project really began with an essay that I wrote for a contest sponsored by the Washington County Historical Society in 1977. And I was in the 7th grade. And I wrote an essay and then made into a speech that I gave in the town oratorical contest the next year, thereby killing the town oratorical contest from that point on. But one of the things about this is that I've been writing about what happened in my childhood and trying to figure out what happened in my childhood, trying to understand these dynamics, trying to open my mind to realize that the Black kids that I knew extremely well, I didn't know as well as I thought I knew. And that there were these whole worlds of experience and reality that had always surrounded me and that I was more aware of and more sensitive to, and in some respects cared more about than most of the other white folks around me did, but that I still didn't understand. And so I have spent a lot of time trying to go back. And one of the discoveries in that process, at one point I started working on a memoir at a point that I was too young and not really strong enough as a writer really to write that memoir. But I wrote this long manuscript. It was about 200 pages long. 20 years ago or so. And then I came back to that a few years ago and said, I'm gonna finish that book. That book was almost done. This will be a fast project. And I went back to that and I reread the manuscript and I realized that my current memories no longer matched my memories of 20 years ago. Not in gigantic ways, but in ways that really mattered. Ways that, like emphasis and what seemed particularly important or not. And so I realized that I, like all of us, that I was an unreliable narrator and that I couldn't trust my own memory, my own judgment about many of these things. And that if I was serious about understanding all this, that I had to actually be a reporter. I had to be a journalist about it. And so I decided that that's what really launched this film project, was that I decided that I was going to go back and I was going to find other people who were part of every one of these stories. And I was going to see how they remembered them. And it's really remarkable how that works. There are things that happen where at the end of the story, there are people dead, really dramatic things. And yet the way I remember it and the way that other people who had the same experience remember it can be very, very different, particularly very different in terms of what it means. And that's what all of this is about. All of our inability to reckon with the past and the very recent past and even the almost present and the present, our struggle to reckon with that and figure out the way forward all comes down to both an instinct to see different meanings in the same events and a desperate need at times to alter the meaning of those events to fit a way of seeing the world that is more comfortable for all of us. And this is way more complicated than just a couple of minutes of talking about it demands. But that has been for me, this has been a deeply introspective experience, deeply revelatory about myself to myself experience, as well as learning so much about the communities that I was a part of, and also becoming a part of them again in ways that they've been excited about and also unexcited about at times. So I guess that would be my.
Great. Donna?
Yeah, I really agree with so much of what Doug was saying. I feel that you can't to hear our whole truth and understand it. You have to listen really well to each other. And what I found sometimes is that people were so traumatized by that time that even if you heard them, they couldn't hear that you heard them. It was like they were just stuck back there in a certain way, because for them their lives hadn't moved past that point. And so, it really is so important to tell the stories as individual stories. But what we did was we stepped back and tried to say, what did we hear again and again that we need to investigate further? That's the way the project went. So we ended up what we call 7 questions and 7 lessons to figure out where can we sort of stick the pen to go a little deeper to take it to the next level. And so it's so important to know that you can't get the systemic story unless you look at the whole system. And a lot of people don't know or don't want to say that there is a system to this, but there is. And, I think Douglas's book really pointed that out to me. That whole era of the contract labor I knew nothing about. And it's like a part of the history that makes light bulbs go on for your own history. So it's like learning history, learning your own story, figuring out what you can do from that point.
Thank you, Donna. I think that's actually a really fantastic moment for us to transition here to listening to each other a little bit for everyone who's been in the audience. So what we're going to do now actually is move to the breakout room portion of our program. So this is the opportunity for everyone who's here to be in breakout rooms with 4 or 5 other people from this program. And we're going to give you 3 questions that you can use to start your discussion. So this is an opportunity for you to share some of your own experience. And also, I think as both of our panelists have said, to also listen to each other. So I'm going to read those discussion questions, and they're also going to be, they're in the chat right now. So you can see them in the chat.
In the chat.
Yeah, so they're in the chat. And if you keep that open, you'll be able to see them when you're in the breakout room. So those questions are, what was your own schooling experience, and was it integrated? And what did you gain, or potentially what did you lose from that experience? So to get to breakout rooms, a little window is going to pop up. It'll say, do you want to join a breakout room? You'll click yes, and then you'll be virtually brought to a room with some of your fellow attendees at this program. We'll have that discussion for around 15 minutes. You'll get a little notice letting you know when that time is running low. And then at the end of that 15 minutes, another little window will pop up saying that you've got 1 minute left in breakout rooms, and you can click leave when you're ready to leave on that little window for the breakout room. So that's what we're going to be doing next in this program. But I also want to make sure that I say thank you to Donna and Doug for all the wisdom that they shared. And I'm already thinking of other connections between their projects as well. And I hope we'll have a chance to follow up with them. So right now, we are going to move to the breakout room discussion. And I hope you have a good conversation.
We're going to begin kind of the second part of our program, which is going to look at the subject from a bit of a wider lens. And we are going to bring in Byron Rushing and Jean Middleton. And if we can get them spotlit or whatever, Catherine, if we're ready to go.
Great. I think we are. We've got Jean spotlight. I think we're waiting for Byron to come on. And I think for everyone who's just come back in from breakout rooms, if for any reason you maybe got dropped off of the main room, or if you're coming into the program a little bit later, you can try to rename yourself with your state initials in the front. That'll help us keep making these breakout rooms full and with people from all of our states represented. So right now, I am really happy to get to bring Byron Rushing into our program to help us see, again, and I think as Donna alluded to, not only the particular story of court-mandated desegregation in Boston, but really the larger picture of education for African-American communities in Boston. So, so Byron, can you maybe tell us a little bit more about that longer story? What is the story for African-American communities in Boston of seeking education?
Thank you, and it's really good to be with you all this evening. Let me just start off with a way that I am enjoying, that's becoming more and more common when we begin talking, and that is that I'm from Massachusetts, and so I'm from I live on land that was occupied wholly by, of course, Native Americans, and on the East Coast by the Massachusetts. It's easy we have an easy way to remember because we decided to name the state after them. But the other thing I want to say at the beginning is something I think that we need to add to that when we introduce ourselves, and that is the first Africans who came to Massachusetts. The first recorded group of Africans coming to Massachusetts came in 1638. And they came in a literal exchange of indigenous people that were being sold into slavery by the Puritans and brought back from that single trip on a ship, Africans that they had seen in the island that they had taken, the Native Americans. And so Africans have been in Massachusetts mostly enslaved from 1638 until the American Revolution. It was always a small population. There never was the kind of agricultural necessity in Massachusetts for mass labor. But at the same time that you had this small group of Africans, in Massachusetts, you also had Massachusetts being involved in the actual slave trade itself. So most of the slave ships that were built in what became the United States were built in New England. In Rhode Island, in Massachusetts, and other parts of New England, but those were the centers for the capitalist slave traders who had a significant influence on the economy of the North, and of course the economy of Massachusetts. And we forget that it wasn't only selling the slaves, but you can't have a textile industry unless you're willing to buy cheap cotton from the South, raised by those enslaved people. In Massachusetts, though, for a variety of reasons, slavery ended early. It ended for the original states, it ended first. And there was the leaders of Massachusetts, of course, were very much involved in the winning side of the American Revolution. And when they wrote their constitution, they were one of the few state constitutions that actually quoted the Declaration of Independence. And it didn't take enslaved people long, or white lawyers who were opposed to slavery, to get together and start to sue. And by 1783, we had a state Supreme Court case that ruled that slavery, because of our state constitutional, was illegal, unconstitutional by our state constitution. Now, there's a lot of arguments about how much white people took that seriously, but there was no legal challenge of that. And in 1790, when we had our first United States Census, Massachusetts is the only state that in that first census that enumerated no slaves. Every other state in the North, of course, all the states in the South, and of course, slaves had their own column in the census, because we had an article of the Constitution that made states want to know how many slaves they had, because there was an advantage in their representation in Congress. They could come up with this fiction that every slave could be equal to 3/5 of a person in the math in determining representation. So for Black people, they saw this as and in Massachusetts, as a remarkable time for them, that they could begin to work on developing a community in a state that had no enslaved people. So they didn't have to worry about the fact that they were always a minority, with the majority being enslaved. And that community engages in two things. The first thing is just live well. But the other piece is civil rights. They wanted to make sure then that they had the rights guaranteed to them under their state constitution. And finally, they were always very conscious of the fact that they were exceptional, and that most Africans in the United States were in the southern states, and most of them were enslaved. And that defined sort of the politics for them. One of the things that they wanted to do, of course, was to make sure that kids were well educated. And they started off by setting up private institutions that they ran to educate those kids. And as that became more popular, as their community increased, as more kids, more families would want their kids to be educated in some kind of primary or grammar school. That school in the numbers increased, a white philanthropist gave money to the city of Boston for the education of Black kids. And the city then decides to, with that money, to open its first public school for Black children. And that school becomes relatively successful, but about at the same time that that school is growing, there is a group in the community who feels that the separate education of those kids is wrong, that they should be able to go to their literally neighborhood schools, that they, no matter where they lived in the city, they all had to come to this one Black school. And they started arguing the point that if they were going to be fully integrated and have full rights in the city, their children should go to the most convenient school and not have to go to this one singular school. It's a story that has so many, goes in so many directions that that would be the whole topic of this of my talk. But the most important piece of that, and what was going to influence education actually in the country, is that the parents sue, and they have a suit against the court system, and they lose that suit. And in the decision that the judge writes, he says that they haven't proven that their school was inferior to the white schools, and therefore they were not being denied a right as long as their school was as good as the other schools. And essentially, this judge in Massachusetts invented the idea, the legal idea of separate but equal. And this is, I'm not sort of guessing at this. It was so much so that his decision got referenced in Plessy versus Ferguson. Right. And so that is a piece of that history that influenced legal history around education and segregated education in the whole country until 54. Wow. What happened then to those kids? Well, they did what any group of activists would do. They then said, okay, let's pass a law. So they went to the legislature. 5 years after this decision, they get the Massachusetts legislature to pass a law saying that schools had to be integrated. And the schools were integrated 5 years before the Civil War in Boston. And no one will be surprised to know that, one, the white kids in the neighborhoods were not invited to come to the Smith School. They closed the Smith School, and all the Black kids went to what were previously white schools. And the other thing that happened was they fired all the teachers. All the Black teachers got fired. And so that is how in the Black community, that's how we moved into an integrated public education after the Civil War in Boston. Wow. Most of those schools were integrated schools. Wow. Because the population of Black people in Boston was so small at the time. And most Black kids who went to school in Boston went to integrated schools until there was a major increase in the percentage of Black people in the city. And of course, that increase came from the movement of Black people after after World War I, but really after the Depression to the north. And one of those cities, of course, that benefited from that was Boston. And then you begin to see those schools that were placed in what would become the middle of Black communities becoming segregated, racially segregated schools. We, of course, called that de facto segregation. It was not purposeful, supposedly. It was happening because that's where Black people were moving. And that population and increased segregation continues through the 50s. And in the early 60s, a number of parents are concerned not about the segregation, but the fact that those predominantly Black schools did not seem to receive the same kind of services and support that the white schools were. And that was their first set of arguments. Yeah. And the school system resisted them at that level. And they finally realized that there was this whole question of the school department actually maintaining segregation in schools when they didn't need to. So when a district was lines were drawn, it was always drawn to favor Black people only going to Black schools and white people not having to worry about that. If it looked like there was mushiness on the boundaries, they'd move the boundaries. And that, of course, is why when Garrity had the federal case before him in the 70s, he took such a forceful position on the resolution of integration in the schools in Boston.
So Byron, if that's okay, I'd love to pivot at this point and bring Jean into the conversation, because I think she's got some points that really reflect on it. And Dr. Harrison, you really bring a unique perspective to this conversation. You know, you graduated from segregated Jim Hill High School in Jackson. You were one of the first Black students at Millsaps College. When you graduated college, you went to Harvard to get your PhD in education in the midst of the sort of integration crisis. So I'd love for you to kind of respond to Byron's points and also talk about what were the differences and similarities you found between Mississippi and Massachusetts on this issue of school integration.
Right, thank you so much. And my part of the presentation will focus more specifically on the legal status, but I have learned so much from Donna and Byron already about Massachusetts. I'm so glad it fits into what I was going to say as well. But the origin and legal status of Massachusetts and Mississippi public schooling, it's quite different. In 1639, Massachusetts established the first free taxpayer-supported public school in the country. And on the other hand, Mississippi didn't establish its first free taxpayer-supported schools until 1868, 229 years later, after Massachusetts. And what we see in Massachusetts that Donna and Byron have discussed is kind of this de facto racial segregation, the subtleties of that emerging, while in Mississippi, it was always an example of a state that originally practiced de jure racial segregation, and in fact, for 229 years, didn't even have schooling for Black citizens. For economic and social reasons, in the South, de jure racial segregation is rooted in the slave code. The de facto segregation in the North is rooted in geography, personal choice, custom, you might even say serendipity, and sometimes with a very slippery reasoning, as we learn later with the Plessy versus Ferguson case. But for economic reasons, slave owners, including, as Byron has shared, the national and international, state, local business interests, determined to control the behavior, the thinking, and the education of their enslaved Africans from the beginning. In fact, Mississippi and Massachusetts both have histories tied to and quite in step with an economy powered by slavery. We see throughout Mississippi law that since the late 1700s, starting with the slave codes, through the post-slavery era with the Black codes, and even written into our respected United States Constitution through the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery and involuntary servitude. Even here we see there remains a caveat around how slavery for Africans and some whites could be possible as punishment for a crime. Well, you might say, well, Doc, what's so wrong with that? You commit a crime, you might have to go back into involuntary servitude. But when we look closely at the 13th Amendment, we find in Mississippi, in particular, and other southern states, many innocuous kind of human actions suddenly became crimes under Mississippi law. Things like juggling, or preaching without a license, or misspending one's earnings, walking during the nighttime, idleness, and insulting gestures. Citizens who were white and associated with Blacks on an equal basis also were fined and jailed. And law enforcement could hire out prisoners to whites who paid their fines that the former slaves could not pay. Even the 14th Amendment in 1868 could not diminish the law atrocities against the human dignity of Blacks. So now how public schooling developed in Mississippi 229 years later than Massachusetts. By the time the 1868 biracial Mississippi legislature voted in a constitution to establish a uniform system of free public schools by taxation for all children between 5 and 21, race was not mentioned in this constitution, in the discussion, and public schools were established across the state. However, we see by 1890, Mississippi established a new constitution that limited voting rights, levied poll taxes in an effort to diminish the Black and progressive white vote. So by the turn of the century, as Black voting power diminished to virtually nothing, the de jure separate but equal doctrine prevailed across Mississippi and other southern states, such that the separate Black and white schools were the custom and practice. And the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision affirmed that, and I was so happy to learn, Byron, I had no idea it had its roots in a Massachusetts case. Mississippi and Massachusetts' response to the legal strategy to desegregate public education was different to me. Many, if not most, whites in Mississippi and Massachusetts, what was alike is that they resisted efforts to desegregate the public schools. In Jackson, at the elementary school level, more than 40% of the white elementary school children were withdrawn from the Jackson public schools over the Christmas break, following the Alexander Holmes decision that Byron mentioned. So this is a massive white exodus from the Jackson schools as a result of the integration of the teaching staff only. It's not children, it's just the teaching staff. And only the teachers at the formerly all Black and all white schools were being integrated. So this was very telling to me at the time. One thing though, living in Cambridge during the 73 Boston school crisis, I was kind of shocked at the violence that I saw on the TV screen. I was not there, but on the TV screen, that did remind me of some of the horrible violence that I saw in Mississippi. But I didn't witness that in Jackson, but I do know that there were some in high schools, there was some pushing back and forth and showing knives and little violence in the high schools. But what struck me so in Jackson was that 40% of the white elementary school students dropped out, and most of them went to the segregationist academies in Jackson. We call them in Jackson the council schools. They were started by the White Citizens Council. But what I learned from thinking through this in preparation, I feel as much as I thought seeing the horror up close of what was going on in Boston, I was fairly certain that Jackson whites felt equally as threatened by what they saw as racially charged changes to their school districts, and something that Douglas Blackman mentioned earlier. Why weren't Jackson whites so violent? History tells us, the record tells us that Mississippi whites long had garnered the financial resources required and used their political connections where they were able to change the state law in resistance to desegregation. With the Alexander v. Holmes ruling stating that Mississippi public schools must desegregate now, the white folks say, fine, we're out. And they went to their private segregationist academies. And there's almost a one-to-one student population correspondence between the number of white students who left the Jackson Public Schools and the number who entered the council segregationist schools. I really hadn't researched the different perspectives held by the Boston Black community regarding desegregation, although I do know that many Black families in Jackson were not eager to send their children to integrate these historically white schools, but many did, most did, for the opportunity, but also they did in support of the greater effort of the work that Medgar and Myrlie Evers started when they filed the first lawsuit to desegregate the Jackson Public Schools shortly before Medgar was murdered. And here again, that lawsuit again is Donna and Byron and Douglas have said, it's all about having access to equal opportunities, equal funding. But there is a great fear, what I saw in both Mississippi and Massachusetts, fear of Blacks rooted in this question of, will Blacks do to whites, will they do to us what we did to them? And Douglas talked about that fear. You see it in Massachusetts and in Mississippi. And sometimes you wonder, why is that, when we know that the white community really holds most, if not all, of the power, so to speak, that's embedded in the law. Whites too often believe the century-old lies about the inhumanity of persons of African descent. A great deal of ignorance about Black people, and that then leads to more fear and belief in the inferiority of Black people, which has always been a way to justify slavery. So I would say that Mississippi and Massachusetts whites who were caught up in this time in their personal history shared a great ignorance regarding Black Americans. They seem to suffer what I call frignorance. It's the white fear of Blacks coupled with the white arrogance and belief of their superiority. You combine that with the greed that grew from slavery, along with the no real concern about the humanity of Black Americans, leads to what E. Franklin Frazier and Lillian Smith described as the insanity of white prejudice and the superiority complex. And so you can combine all that together in a mix, the ignorance, the arrogance that you get, and the oppression of non-whites, it brings about this constant struggle for freedom, which so wonderfully explained already from Boston and Leland, Mississippi. Another thing that I did find similar between Massachusetts and Mississippi is the strong opposition to the education of Black Americans, the portrayal of Black Americans as beasts, and the misuse of the power of white money, resources, and white skin, again, fueled by fear and ignorance and greed and insanity. Another belief common to both Massachusetts and Mississippi Black community members is the fundamental interest, and I think that's where all of the speakers have ended, and I'm going to end here too, the fundamental interest in securing a high quality and well-funded education for all children. Equal per pupil expenditures of state funds with equal quality educational services is at the heart and the root of all of these desegregation lawsuits. That's what Medgar and Myrlie Evers thought when they filed the suit against the Jackson schools in 1963. Equal per pupil expenditures of state funds for Black students has always been at the root of our struggle in Mississippi, and our inability to seem to do that right and well is rooted in our history of slavery. It's what our former president called America's original sin, and we are still struggling with it. But we see from Massachusetts and Mississippi that Blacks and whites are still working together to achieve this high quality education for all children. Because if we don't do that, we know our country is going down the drain. So
Thanks.
Okay, good, thanks.
No, that's great. And that's a wonderful kind of pivot point to our final breakout session. And folks have a lot to discuss and chew on. I'm hoping Brian might be able to post in the chat some of the questions that we thought, but if there are other questions that come to mind based on these two wonderful presentations, feel free. And Catherine, do you want to?
Yeah, so I'll help introduce our final breakout room. And I also want to say a really deep thank you to Byron Rushing and G. Milton Harrison for those really extraordinary history lessons. I think Stuart and I had a lot of follow-up questions we wanted to ask, but we also know we want to make some space for everyone in the audience to get a chance to discuss some of what they heard with each other. And so for this breakout room, what we're going to ask our questions for you. And again, you can modify these based on things that you've heard, but our questions are really to get to the local and to ask, in what ways does your local community still struggle with these issues? And whose stories do you think need to be heard in order to address these issues in your community? Or is there anything you heard today, perhaps it sparks your thinking? So as with last time, you will see a little window pop up that asks you if you want to join a breakout room. When you click yes, you should be brought to a breakout room with your fellow attendees. If for any reason you're not able to see anyone, you can always come back to this main room and we'll try to move you around to a new breakout room. But thank you again to Byron Rushing and to G. Milton Harrison for that really, again, extraordinary history lesson. When we said the longer picture, they really took us literally, and I deeply appreciate that in so many ways, really enriching and important. So I believe we are ready for breakout rooms, and you should see the notice coming up in your window soon.
We're although we are running long, I know our friends in the central time zone are probably getting a little hungry, so we're not going to take too much longer. But I think, Catherine, that we were hoping to give each panelist a short kind of closing statement space. Is that right?
Yeah, so as we've reached the end of our program, first, for anyone who wants to share something from their breakout room or reflection in the chat, please feel free to do that. And we also wanted to ask our panelists who are here with us if they had a final reflection in a brief minute or less reflection about why this issue matters today. To open it up for our panelists to give their own reflection for that question.
I will just say, as a member of the Jackson Public School Board right now, that I represent all of us, Black and white, who are still struggling with our state to give adequate funding to all of our schools. That's the biggest problem we have in Mississippi. I can't speak for my other states, but the folk who are running our state are so anti-public education for all children. It's appalling. And I'm so happy to have read Douglas's book to know about Brian. And I feel like Brian and Donna, I must have met you sometime when I was in Massachusetts, because it took me a long time to finish my degree. But that's what's got to happen in Mississippi. It's just appalling. And white kids are suffering too. And our whole economy is suffering because of this racial ignorance that we keep perpetuating.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think that in the North and in a place like Massachusetts, and the where there generally is support for public education. That support for public education, of course, comes from the people who live in those communities where public education works. And so there's a kind of spillover to other communities, but it is just that the discrepancy between both political and financial support for those schools in poor communities and in communities of color it remains as exaggerated as it has been for such a long time. And there've been experiments. We have an experiment in Massachusetts that's been going on for a while, where a number of Black kids are bused to the suburbs to go to school. We call it Metco, but it's not most of the kids, and it's expensive. And of course, it is just it is so unusual, so you don't live there, you don't live in these suburbs, so on one hand, if white people are so insistent on living with themselves. I mean, white people love segregation. Even white liberals Then up white liberals in Massachusetts love segregation. The average white person in Boston, when they get up to go to work, do not see a Black person until they get to work. Right? And that, and they like it. They might tell you all the reasons why it is so, but they enjoy it. They like being with themselves. And so their solution is, well, maybe we should bring the Black kids out here for a few hours for school. The whole zip code analysis of America, right? And that and of course, and until that changes, you're going to have this incredibly dire situation. Black people, there's always been a significant minority of Black people who don't like integration. We'd always thought there was a better way to do it. There was always thought that there would be a better way of getting their kids educated and all kinds of things. And so even in Boston, we set up community schools in the African American community, but could never get the kind of support that was necessary, right, to have them expand and then eventually to have them survive. But that, people might visit that. But in Boston, the decision for most Black people, and I think Donna says this so well, we just completely missed how traumatic this was for the kids that experienced it. And, and I've talked to kids that, now, in their 30s now, right? They're the people, they want to know why their parents sent them. They're angry about this. Why did their parents send them? And then finally, of course, if you just look at the numbers, Black people have given up on Boston. So I don't know how many cities this is going to happen in, but in Boston, Black people have just given up. It's just the white people there, they don't have enough Black people to defend themselves against the white people. Hopefully they will have them in the suburbs of Atlanta, right? Because that's certainly where they're going. But the Black population has not increased in Boston in 20 years. They just stopped. And I think that's going to have a big effect on a number of cities our size in the North.
Thank you. Donna or Doug, are there final reflections for you?
Sure, I'll jump in just for a sec. And I think this corresponds with what you've just heard from other panelists, that we all have gotten a lot more familiar over the past year because of fine work by others with the notion of being an anti-racist, and the idea behind that it's not enough really to just not be racist. It's not enough to not do bad things, that there's a burden, particularly if we want to live in a society that is closer to what I think we would all say is the society we want to live in, that it's not enough to just not do bad. It's not enough to just live with other white people in your neighborhood and be perfectly happy with that, and just act a little troubled about it. That's not enough. And the thing that has become really apparent to me as I've looked harder and harder at these things, and in our breakout group, the question was, well, what are the solutions? And the kinds of, because we can sit here all day and talk about and define the problems and the proofs of the problem, but the solutions have to do with a kind of anti-racist sort of posture toward education. And one says that as long as we keep ending up with this de facto version of segregation or freedom of choice, as we called it in the 1960s, but where basically white people remain in their pleasant enclaves and Black people just begin to have better funded, maybe almost equitable, back to what I was saying earlier, separate but kind of equal. If we're okay with that, just because you don't have the Citizens Council running the schools anymore, or the Klan doing violent things, if we're okay with that, and we only focus on sort of legal parity and financial equity, well, then we're headed toward a kind of pleasant apartheid, and I don't want to live in pleasant apartheid. And a pleasant apartheid is also a doomed society. It's a doomed society. And so, like, I have lots of adult friends today. I live in Atlanta. And Byron, you just referred to the black suburbs of Atlanta. You know, it's an astonishing phenomenon. And it's a wonderful life there. And they're having, you know, people lead wonderful lives there, and they're wonderful people there. But that's not the society we want. And that's not the society where Derek Chauvin doesn't grow up to be Derek Chauvin. You know, if we want these terrible things that have been happening to just not happen and not have to worry about how do we punish the police who do bad things, if we want to just make those incidents not happen, then we have to be serious and open and vulnerable and have leaders who can help to lead us toward a different way, a different path, toward a different kind of society, because the path that we're on right now is the path to pleasant apartheid.
Thank you, Doug, Byron, and Dr. Hairston. And Donna, was there any last reflection that you would like to give? Oh, I think you're on mute, Donna.
I just want to say I agree, except it's not so pleasant, that apartheid. You know, it's so you know, and it's so complex about, you know, I'd really love to see. I've never seen this, but what's the relationship between, and you know, there's a school to prison pipeline material, but what's the relationship between that and the history of desegregation? Oh. That's a question. What's the relationship between increased policing and the economic reality that we deal with in terms of who has work and the work of you know, the economics of taking care of imprisoning people? You know, there's so much that we don't look at, and that I think we're afraid to look at, and we have to look at it together, because it is really, like Doug says, taking us to some very dangerous places.
Thank you, Donna, and thank you to all of our panelists. This has really been just an absolutely extraordinary conversation with so much depth, so much history, and so much experience behind it. I think the hardest part of this program is stopping the conversations, because we want them to keep going, because I'm learning so much from everybody. But we've already kept everyone a little bit over their time. And I think probably folks in Massachusetts are trying to get their kids to bed, and maybe everyone in Mississippi is a little bit hungry right now. So I want to just close with just final thanks to my co-pilot in Mississippi, Stuart Rockoff, to all of our Mississippi and Massachusetts staff on this program, to our panelists, a really deep thank you. I also want you to know that there is a survey for this program, so we'd like to hear feedback from you about your experience, what you got out of the program, what you learned. So there should be in that chat a link to the survey. If you click on that, you'll be able to open the survey and fill it out at your leisure. We'll also make sure to send it to everybody who registered for the event. Finally, and most importantly, we will be taking a brief pause from our MS+ programs in May to prepare for our finale MS+ program in June. So our finale MS+ will be June 17th, and it will be about music and musical traditions and communities in our state. So I'm very much looking forward to that program. Hope we will see you all there. Deepest thanks again to everybody for this fantastic program.
Fabulous.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for all the panelists and all the audience for being a part of it. We're excited to see you in June.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.